Just when you think that things in our government can't get any worse or sink any lower, a new shocking revelation pops up. And that's what we've seen here in the last few days in our country as something we found out about that no one knew existed until I think probably just this last week, and that is what's called the Disinformation Board. In the Department of Homeland Security, it's been revealed just in the last couple of days that there's a new Disinformation Governance Board that's been recently created to fight the spread of disinformation on the internet. And this is problematic on a lot of levels. Certainly it's problematic constitutionally and legally in our country with our First Amendment. It's basically trashing the First Amendment. It's certainly problematic politically because I think the people who are bringing this to pass in the Biden administration are going to pay for this heavily at the polls because people don't want someone above them controlling their thoughts and their opinions. And to put the Department of Homeland Security over the idea of disinformation, of what's true and what's untrue, is almost laughable really in our country at this time because you're doing this with a group that can't even take care of our border. And yet we want this same group now to be in charge of our speech. And so basically what this Disinformation Governance Board is going to be tasked with, and again, it'll be under the leadership ultimately of Alexandro Mayorkas, the DHS secretary. But it's going to, the purpose is stated like this: it's to take on lies and deceit tied to the 2022 midterms and ostensibly the liars and deceivers who tell the lies and the deceits. So it's going to basically be an authoritarian arm or an authoritarian regime of the Department of Homeland Security. So this will make this governing board under the Department of Homeland Security a kind of the final arbiter about what information to trust versus what information to label untrustworthy. Now, when I was in high school, we read a book called 1984 by George Orwell. When I was in high school, this was the mid to late 70s. So 1984 was still just a few years in the future. And we read the book, and it's a fascinating book to read. It seemed like something that was kind of funny, really a little bit. But you could think maybe there could be a little bit of truth to it because we saw what was happening in places like communist China and the Soviet Union back in those days. But if you remember the novel 1984 by George Orwell, in that book there was a department called the Ministry of Truth. And here's what someone says about this in a recent article in the New York Times, or in the Washington Times. It says, this has led to some comparisons to 1984's Ministry of Truth. The protagonist of Orwell's classic was a man named Winston Smith. He worked in a ministry, a governmental department that controls information coming from news, entertainment, arts, and education. Smith's sole role at the ministry is to correct historical records to align with the messaging of Big Brother, who's the leader or the symbol of the novel's ruling totalitarian party. Of course, that's where we get the idea down through the years. We've talked about, Big Brother is watching you. But again, the main character in this novel by George Orwell works in a ministry called the Ministry of Truth, where they're correcting all the historical records to align with the messaging of Big Brother. Well, I saw an article in the New York Post, and it says, Big Sister is watching you, because the leader of this governing board, this Disinformation Governance Board, is actually going to be a woman. Nina Jankowicz. She's been appointed to lead this governing board. Now, many have pointed out that Nina Jankowicz said that when Hunter Biden's laptop was exposed, that this was Russian disinformation. And so you have a person who followed a lot of disinformation who's now going to be in charge of disinformation. So there's a lot of irony here in what's happening. But when you think about past history, Adolf Hitler through Joseph Goebbels, he had a ministry of truth. Joseph Stalin had a ministry of truth as well. And some have pointed out now that Joe Biden is also going to have a ministry of truth here in America. But again, it's kind of George Orwell's dystopian 1984 that's come alive. So what we have here is a government-sanctioned Department of Disinformation supposedly aimed at rooting out lies. But as someone says, but actually instead, at its own root, it'll advance the lies that the government wants told. So all of this is part really of the Great Reset. Just the government control reaching into every area of our lives and a massive takeover. We've been seeing this over the last few years with the COVID crisis and with other things that are happening in our world, with inflation now, with shortages that are taking place. As all these crises are mounting, government is seizing more and more control over the lives of American citizens. One article I read, again, this one from the Washington Times, the title of the article is "America Flirts with George Orwell's 1984 and the Department of Disinformation." And it says that America is turning a frightening corner. And I don't know, many of you may have seen about a week ago, President Obama gave a speech, and he talked a great deal in this speech about fighting disinformation. So this is kind of a talking point now that's coming out of Washington of the importance of fighting against and kind of putting down disinformation. But the New York Times had an article this week that says Barack Obama takes on a new role fighting disinformation. And Barack Obama has just said himself in this article, disinformation is a threat to our democracy. And so this is a line now that's coming out of Washington. Our biggest threat now is disinformation. We have to do something about it, appoint this governing board over it all. One person responded this way to former President Obama's quote that disinformation is a threat to our democracy. The person said this: "No, it's not. The government is the real threat to societal freedoms. Disinformation, on the other hand, is just another word for freedom of speech." And so what we see in our world today happening is greater and greater control in every area of life. And there's another article that I've run across in Politico. This quote's a little bit lengthy, but it's really good. Let me read this to you. It says, "Who among us thinks the government should add to its work list the job of determining what is true and what is disinformation? And who thinks the government is capable of telling the truth? Our government produces lies and disinformation at an industrial scale and always has. It overclassifies vital information to block its own citizens from becoming any the wiser. It pays thousands of press aides to play hide the seek with facts. This is the government that lied about winning the war in Vietnam, that said the Watergate affair was a third-rate burglary, that fought a secret war in Nicaragua, that lied about a clandestine love affair in the White House, that used faulty intelligence to force a war in the Middle East. Even President Barack Obama shortchanged the truth. Of 600 Obama statements PolitiFact checked during his administration, a quarter of them fell into the red zone of being false, mostly false, or pants on fire false. Not so long ago, 50 intelligence officers, each of them smarter and better informed than any DHS brainiac, assured the nation that the Hunter Biden laptop story bore all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. How did that work out? The idea that COVID could have come from a Chinese lab was similarly dismissed as disinformation. Now it's considered a legitimate possibility by the Biden administration. Meanwhile, we have documented proof from the Washington Post that even Joe Biden often can't handle simple truths. Now, again, it's kind of a little bit of a sarcastic article there, but again, the point is we're going to appoint people to be the arbiters of what's true and what's false, who have really falsehood on an industrial scale. But again, what we're seeing here, this is obviously significant politically. It's very significant constitutionally, but I think it's very significant prophetically. All of this that we see happening is part of a global satanic scheme to ready the world for the Antichrist. This is being energized by demonic forces that are preparing the world for Satan's man who's going to come on the scene in the end times, the final Antichrist. Again, read Revelation 13 if you've never read that chapter. It talks about a one-world economy, a one-world government, and ultimately a one-world religion where everybody will have to bow down and worship the same person. Again, the ultimate control over world thought and world opinion. We already see this happening in Russia. I talked with a young man this week whose father is a very well-known Christian leader in Moscow. And he told me that his father has written a letter to Vladimir Putin, kind of protesting the war and calling on the war in Ukraine to be ended. And he said his father, by doing that, simply writing that letter, faces years in prison if the government decides to prosecute him. So we see this in parts of our world already where thought is controlled. Now, we see it obviously in communist China in incredible ways. And we see increasing government control economically. We've talked in here in recent days about the digital currency, the central bank digital currency, or a digital dollar, a dollar that can be programmed to determine where you can spend it. So we're seeing an economic takeover of our lives. It will dictate what we can spend and how we can spend it. And we've seen all of this happening through the CDC and through Dr. Fauci and through lockdowns and control through lockdowns and vaccines. I don't know if you've watched in the news that the lockdowns over in China, but I mean, it's just horrific to watch what's happening there. It happened in Shanghai. Now it's happening in Beijing, where, millions of people, 22 million people in Shanghai, a complete lockdown of the city, and people have to eat one meal a day. They can't get out and get food or get medicine. It's just a horrific thing to watch, but they have total control over their populace. And just like in those countries now, through this Disinformation Governance Board, we see that thoughts, opinion, and information will now be controlled. This is something we could have never imagined in this country. It's dystopian. And again, I think Orwell evidently was right. He was just about 40 years too early in 1984. But big tech, big media, big government are all working in concert. This is a perfect setup for the Antichrist. I received an email just today from Senator James Lankford. He sent it out to a group of people that I'm on this kind of group email. And he was saying that he had delivered a speech about censorship now in America, how big tech and big media are censoring information or thoughts they don't like. And he gives a speech on censorship, and that speech now, he's being blocked and locked out of YouTube. So he sent out this email and he said, think of the irony of this. I give a speech about censorship, and the speech about censorship is censored. I mean, it's hard to make up these kinds of things. But again, through digital currency, through controlling people's behavior, through lockdowns and vaccines and masks and all these other things, and then through now control even of people's thoughts and their opinions that they express. We see things in our world really just accelerating quickly and moving towards the kind of world that the Bible predicts when the Antichrist is going to rule the world. So we just see constant, continued incursions into our freedoms in every area. And there's a takeover really in every area of life, and it's just relentless, and it's going to continue. And for those of us who know the Lord and who understand the Bible, we know where this is all headed. And again, it's just another sign on the road to the end times. And it's another sign for us that the coming of Christ could be very near. So keep looking up and be encouraged in light of these things that are happening. Thank you again so much for watching this video. God bless you. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.